When King Louis XIV died in 1715, he left the French state functionally insolvent. Decades of relentless military conflict, specifically the War of the Spanish Succession, combined with the exorbitant costs of the Palace of Versailles, had entirely drained the national coffers. This chart illustrates the staggering scale of that insolvency. The French government carried a consolidated sovereign debt of roughly 3 billion livres. That liability was equivalent to about 85% of the world's estimated physical gold stock at the time. Against an annual interest obligation of 86 million livres, the state's gross annual revenue was a meager 165 million. Compounding this debt crisis was a stagnant commercial economy. France operated strictly on a gold and silver standard. To manage its debts, the crown repeatedly debased the physical coinage, destroying public trust. Merchants hoarded their metal, leaving the domestic economy completely recessed, illiquid, and heavily burdened by punitively high interest rates. Within this environment of absolute fiscal desperation, the French regent turned to an exiled Scottish financier named John Law. Law held a radical macroeconomic theory. He argued that relying on physical metallic money was an arbitrary constraint on growth. He posited that the total quantity and velocity of money circulating in an economy dictated its vitality, and that a credit-based paper money supply could stimulate commerce far more effectively than rigid gold. In 1716, Law convinced the French government to let him establish a private banking institution, the Banque Générale, with the authority to issue paper notes. Initially operating on fractional reserves, the bank accepted physical gold and silver deposits and issued paper currency explicitly redeemable in coin. Because these paper notes offered a stable unit of account, they quickly circulated more efficiently than heavy, easily debased coinage. As paper liquidity rapidly flooded back into the commercial system, domestic trade expanded, and crippling interest rates finally plummeted. Law's initial experiment worked with such speed and efficacy that the Crown believed he had discovered a permanent solution to their sovereign debt crisis. With public confidence in paper currency established, Law moved to securitize the massive French national debt. He offered the public a compelling arbitrage opportunity. Citizens holding heavily discounted government bonds could use them to purchase newly issued shares in his newly formed joint stock enterprise, the Mississippi Company. The company accepted these bonds at their original face value, effectively transferring the state's debt onto the company's balance sheet. To attract the investor capital required to absorb a 3 billion livre liability, Law consolidated the nation's revenue streams. Between 1718 and 1719, his company acquired the monopoly over the French tobacco trade, the African slave trade, and the East Indies trade. It purchased the exclusive right to mint national coins and eventually the right to collect internal French taxes. All of this was attached to the supposedly limitless resources of the Louisiana colony underpinning the equity. To maximize market participation, Law introduced aggressive margin lending. He allowed investors to buy 500 livre shares with a down payment of just 75 livres, paying the rest in small monthly installments. He also introduced options contracts, known as les primes, allowing speculators to purchase the right to acquire stock at a future date for a strike price, driving pure financial speculation. The introduction of financial leverage ignited an unparalleled public mania. The Rue de Quincampoix in Paris turned into a frenetic open-air stock exchange. Aristocrats and laborers jostled for stock, driving the share price on a parabolic curve from its initial 500 livres to an astronomical 10,000 livres in just under 12 months. By early 1720, Law had successfully integrated France's fiscal policy, its central bank, its tax collection, and its international trade into a single corporate entity. But this architecture had a critical vulnerability. The state's recovery now depended entirely on maintaining an artificially inflated stock price. The structural fragility of the system was sealed in February 1720, when the central bank was merged directly into the Mississippi Company. This fusion gave Law unchecked authority over the monetary system, allowing him to issue fiat banknotes that were no longer required to be backed by physical gold reserves. This diagram maps out the resulting mechanical doom loop. As early investors began selling their shares to convert their paper gains back into physical gold, Law attempted to stop the price from crashing. He publicly guaranteed that the central bank would purchase any company share presented to it for a fixed price of 9,000 livres. As we follow the loop, the consequences become clear. To honor that guarantee, the bank had to fire up the printing press whenever selling pressure mounted. By turning corporate stock directly into fiat currency, law abruptly doubled the total money supply of France in a matter of months, the volume of paper completely detached from the physical metallic reserves. Because the sheer volume of paper currency injected into the system vastly outstripped actual economic output, the domestic economy buckled. By January 1720, the monthly inflation rate reached 23%. The cost of basic food prices soared by as much as 60%. Law had created a severe liquidity trap. Flooding the market with unbacked fiat currency and suppressing interest rates yielded no durable commercial improvement. The surplus capital simply incentivized further, reckless financial speculation, entirely divorcing the nation's wealth from productive investment. As hyperinflation rapidly eroded the purchasing power of the paper levy, the collective illusion fractured. Astute market participants realized that the nominal paper value of the banknotes and shares vastly exceeded the total quantity of physical gold and colonial commodities that actually existed in the kingdom. Recognizing the bank's reserves were inadequate, Law attempted a controlled depreciation. On May 21, 1720, he issued a royal edict mandating a 50% reduction in the legal value of both the banknotes and the shares. Rather than stabilizing the economy, the edict instantly shattered public trust, triggering a massive bank run as everyone rushed to liquidate their holdings at once. This chart illustrates the breathtaking speed of the market collapse. Drained of coinage, the company went bankrupt. The stock plummeted in stages throughout late 1720, crashing from its 10,000 livre peak down to its 500 livre baseline, a 97% loss. While the retail public was financially decimated, several insiders executed spectacularly profitable exits. The economist Richard Cantillon correctly predicted the resulting hyperinflation and accumulated a massive fortune by short-selling the French currency. Meanwhile, aristocratic insiders exploited their political proximity to law, converting their inflated paper shares into tangible gold, silver, and real estate, actively draining the central bank's remaining reserves just before the total collapse. The bubble did not create new wealth. The Louisiana colony remained largely undeveloped, and its revenues were negligible. Instead, the hyper-financialization facilitated a massive, asymmetric transfer of purchasing power from middle and lower-class retail investors directly into the hands of political elites and sophisticated financial operators. Left with millions of worthless banknotes and a paralyzed domestic economy, the French state intervened with a draconian financial restructuring process known as the visa. The visa was a state-mandated forensic audit. Citizens were required to surrender their paper assets, along with a detailed accounting of how they acquired them. The state then applied massive, arbitrary haircuts to anyone deemed a speculator, canceling financial claims to shrink the money supply before converting the remaining reduced claims back into low-yielding state bonds. Law was dismissed from his posts and fled Paris in disgrace. The visa successfully returned the economy to a metallic standard, but it did so by financially immolating the investing public. The trauma of this bust instilled a deep, multi-generational distrust of central banking and paper credit within the French ruling class for the next 80 years. Without the flexible credit mechanisms its rivals used to expand, the French state relied on regressive taxation to service its debts. This structural dysfunction persisted for decades, eventually reaching the fiscal breaking point that triggered the revolution in 1789. The failure of Law's system demonstrates the systemic risk of subordinating currency stability to the maintenance of asset prices. When a central bank's mandate is tied to an artificial equity peg, it creates a feedback loop that eventually exhausts both the currency's value.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to know and learn for the historic events of the time.